The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. So we did two stories recently about the economy and personal finance, and I've got a follow-up. So to set this up, we did a story about how there are elements within the mortgage industry that are starting to show signs of sort of approximating some of the characteristics we saw before the mortgage crash and the subsequent recession that took place in 2007 and 2008. We also did a story, it might have been early last week or maybe more likely the week before, about how now car loans are getting longer and longer, where the average car loan now is approaching 6 years in duration. And I talked about how that is incredibly predatory in the sense that you have a depreciating asset which loses half of its value in its first 3 years. And the idea of financing that with interest over a 6-year period is just a recipe for ending up in worse financial circumstances. And it really just does not make sense. And there's a new report from Bloomberg now that's pointing out that the auto loan world is starting to see a sort of subprime debt fiasco. There is starting to be an uptick in, I guess they're not called foreclosures, they'd be called repossessions when it comes to cars, and an uptick in the percentage of all auto loan amount, like the total amount of money loaned out for cars. Let me back up. Let me say it a different way. The percentage of all money loaned for car purchases that would be considered part of a subprime loan is going up over time. So this is yet another area. It's sort of two things. Number one, sometimes when the economy is good or improving for a while, you see people more willing to extend themselves further. So instead of buying, a $20,000 car that they could afford on a 3-year loan, they get a $30,000 car on a 6-year loan because they have general confidence in the economy. So that can be why you start to see people overextending themselves and taking riskier loans. But that also is one of the first areas that ends up crushing people when you do see a recession. And we're starting to see those indicators in the auto industry.
And also, you think $20,000 for 3 years versus $30,000 for 6 years. It's not too different, but when you add up the interest, the difference there could be a big deal.
That's right. I haven't run the numbers, but there's no doubt that the longer the loan is, the more interest you are paying as a percentage of the principal.
Obviously people are more weary of taking out mortgages because we've learned the lesson of the 2007 housing crash, and not just, the public has learned that lesson, but also there's laws that reflect that they're not able to give out loans as easily. But since we haven't learned that lesson with cars, and because cars aren't valued nearly as much as homes are, maybe they're a tenth of the value as, say, your home, I think we do run this risk. And obviously you can't predict the economy.
No, but there's also a key difference because the cars decrease in value over time, whereas the home presumably increases in value. So it's anybody who thinks about a mortgage and a car loan in the same way is missing some sort of elementary aspects of that. And there's also, we talked about on the regular show today, what products prey on the ignorant or uninformed. And I didn't mention it, but these hyper predatory auto loans, sometimes when you see a commercial that says, we finance anybody, right?
It's not a good sign.
It's not a good sign because the way that they can do it is saying, yeah, we'll give you a loan. We'll loan you 30% of the car's value. You've got to come up with 70%. And then we'll loan you the other 30% at 25% interest or something like that. So yes, they will make you an offer, but it will be one that is, if even remotely affordable, incredibly aggressive and predatory. So this is not a good sign, and it is yet another one of these underlying factors that we may be approaching a slowdown, a correction, a recession, call it what you want. We don't know exactly when it will be. I don't believe economists know either, but what we do know is we're 4 years closer to the next one than we were 4 years ago, and I think that thinking about it that way is a really good idea. There's a new analysis of studies in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and it looked at the long-term heart health, weight, stroke incidence, and blood pressure levels of people who use artificial sweeteners instead of sugar. Okay, this includes aspartame.
Splenda, all those
right. Oh, yeah.
names.
So Splenda, Stevia, Equal, all of those. Many of them are aspartame. Some are non-aspartame sweeteners, whatever. And what they found is that those who replace sugar with sweeteners end up weighing more than their sugar-consuming counterparts over the long term. Now, immediately, the headlines, as often is the case when you see a study like this, are sweeteners cause weight gain. And of course, that's not what the study is saying. What the study is saying is that those individuals who use sweeteners instead of sugar are also experiencing more weight gain over time than those who use sugar. That doesn't mean it is caused by the sweeteners. And it could be as simple as you feel better about your diet because you're having a sweetener instead of sugar, so you eat more other stuff, right?
Exactly.
And this is sort of like the fat-free phenomenon that happened during the 90s. There was this big move to fat-free. And I remember Snackwell's was a brand that, hey, it's fat-free cookies. So people eat way more. They're still consuming a ton of sugar. They're consuming a ton of what's in there in lieu of the fact that there's fat. And then they end up gaining weight.
And not like the aspartame itself is great for you either, but I think that's what makes up the difference here, because say you buy a Diet Coke, you see that it has 0 calories on it versus a regular Coke that has 200.
Sure.
Well, then you can grab more food for your portion. You know, that's
right.
That's what you can eat to make up for that.
Not to
difference.
mention, this is less scientifically confirmed, but there are some studies which suggest that the regular consumption of some of these artificial sweeteners can actually affect your ability to metabolize fat, sugar, carbohydrates, whatever. So even by virtue of eating the same amount of food, but merely switching from a sugar drink to an artificial sweetener-based drink, your body might be less able to metabolize some of what you're eating. And again, that's still somewhat speculative, but there's a possibility of that because these artificial sweeteners are, as the word suggests, artificial and not naturally occurring. You know, like when you eat a fruit and there's naturally occurring sugar, that's very different than when you put equal into your coffee, for example.
And I'm all for nutrition facts being easily read and displayed in restaurants and everything else. But I think people have to realize that that's not the be-all and end-all. It's not just about the macronutrient ratios and what you see. It's also just the ingredients and how natural those are.
The other day, I had a little... there was a surprise party for a friend at my apartment, and different people brought different items. And there's one particular person who was invited who just can't cook. So like mostly everybody cooked something or made something, whatever. And I was the grill master at this event. And someone brought a couple of snacks that were sort of like, manufactured food products, as I like to call them. And one of them was pizza bites, okay? I looked at the back of this bag of pizza bites. Now, if you say pizza bites, okay, what is that? Well, you make a pizza dough, which is water, flour. Actually, I don't know whether pizza doughs have egg. I'm not sure.
Not usually.
Not usually, right? It's water, flour, and salt, maybe, and yeast. I don't know. Anyway, you think about what's pizza dough. It's like 3 to 5 ingredients. It's cheese
Tomato
pizza.
sauce?
So you've got tomato sauce. And if you buy just a can of tomatoes, the ingredients are tomatoes, maybe salt, maybe basil. That's basically it. And then cheese. Okay. So I'm talking about all in. We've got, 5 to 8 ingredients total for this thing.
That would be reasonable.
That would be reasonable. There were 73 ingredients. We looked at the back of the bag. We actually, I looked at it and I said, this is kind of crazy. And I read down 73 ingredients in pizza bites, which you could make at home with somewhere between 5 and 8 ingredients.
Yeah, 73. You may have been off by a couple, and I think if the margin of error is anything greater than like 3 or 4, you probably shouldn't eat that.
Right, yeah. And just bizarre. And I didn't partake, but it was a very, very interesting snack. And, with
Were
pizza...
you cooking them on the grill?
These were meant to be oven baked.
Yeah. So did anyone partake?
I didn't see anybody eat them.
Okay.
Yeah, it's right. That's the type of thing. I remember getting there were these, that brand Amy's? Are you familiar with that brand?
I don't know.
It's like your, sort of like vegan, vegetarian, organic.
Oh, yes.
They had, so you can get like Amy's chili or whatever.
Right. I've had that.
Amy's discontinued pizza bites, and I used to
No.
get those like 10 years ago. And, they had like a dozen ingredients or something like
shame.
that. Yeah, it was a shame that those were gone. Okay, last thing I want to talk about here. New York workers are lobbying in favor of no surprise scheduling. This is an issue at a lot of fast food restaurants where you are not necessarily going to know what your schedule is until very shortly before your shift. This is sometimes called being on call, as the term may be. Now, if you're a doctor and you work in a family clinic with 5 doctors, you would often have doctors sort of take on-call shifts. So they might be a week shift where 2 doctors trade off being on call and the other 3 are not on call. And then the following week, a different 2 doctors are on call for those middle of the night phone calls or whatever the case may be. In the fast food world, you are, in many cases, unless you have actually submitted a vacation day, you're kind of on call all the time. If you work Monday through Thursday and then Saturday, for example, you might think, well, Friday I can drive 3 hours away to the beach. Maybe not. Sometimes you're expected to be within 90 minutes of the store at all times in case you are called in.
So it's not that you're scheduled to work and maybe they call you up and ask you if you can add another shift if you're available that day.
No, you're expected to be available.
Neighborhood.
That's exactly right. And of course, this is damaging in a number of ways. Number one, you don't have predictable time off. If you have family responsibilities, if you have to work another job, which many people in fast food have to do because it is very poorly paid, you essentially can't have guaranteed time off unless you've submitted and asked for it off, which you usually get grief for doing as well. The other issue is it makes it really difficult for you to be a sort of steady consumer in the economy because you don't necessarily know how much money you're going to be making. If it depends on, well, did someone else call out, so I'm getting called in, your paycheck will vary significantly from week to week, not because you're changing your availability, merely because you're at the whim of what it is that management decides to do. McDonald's, one of the prime targets of this protest in the city of New York, a regular offender, allegedly.
Or if you find out at the beginning of the week that you're scheduled to work maybe 3 or 4 shifts, and then shortly before your shift is going to start, they call you up and say that we don't actually need you because our labor numbers are too high right now. We're not getting a lot of sales, and we have enough people working here.
Absolutely.
You can just stay home. Well, if you need to make your rent, that's going to be a big issue, and not one maybe necessarily that the doctors would face as much as the fast food workers. Because
Absolutely.
Obviously, the doctors are going to be well off.
Difficult to make appointments. If you've got to go to the doctor and you're on call every weekday and it's Wednesday and you're not scheduled for Thursday and you make an appointment to go to the doctor, your doctor might have a policy that unless you cancel within 24 hours, you have to pay your copay no matter what. And then that morning, McDonald's calls you and says, we need you in. So you either now have to pay a copay for an appointment you're not going to, or you have to maybe lose your job or at least risk of reduced paycheck that week because you decided to go to the doctor. It's a disaster. It also often applies, it's not just McDonald's and it's not just fast food. Hospitality and retail stores are also known for this. When I worked at Circuit City when I was in high school and college, this was not really an issue. We had our schedules printed at least a full week ahead of time.
Did they ever call you up and say that we're short-staffed?
You could be offered the opportunity to come in, but you were under no obligation to do it. And sometimes I would because I wanted to make more money, particularly if it was a weekend and we were on commission or something like that. But you were not, by the way, I'm not defending, Circuit City had a ton of disastrous practices, but this was one thing that they actually did right.
Yeah, when I was 17, I worked at Domino's Pizza, and every now and then I would go in for a shift, and maybe an hour or two in, they'd say that we don't really need you right now because we're not getting too much business. You can go home. And I was thrilled at the time. Not necessarily, no.
Really?
And I was thrilled at the time because I was 17, didn't really need the job. It was just, I can go hang out with my friends now instead. But if you rely on that paycheck, you could be very upset.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think it absolutely makes sense to have some more structure here. Not only do fast food and retail and other companies take advantage of government welfare benefits. In other words, part of the reason why they are able to get away with paying employees as little as they do is because there is a social safety net by virtue of which their employees will be able to supplement their income with government benefits. So number one, these supposedly independent and successful businesses are depending on government benefits being paid in order to keep their employees able to afford the basic necessities. Right. And in addition, they take further advantage of these employees with this constantly on-call thing, sending people home, irregular paychecks, et cetera, et cetera. So let's introduce some structure there. I agree with this 100%, and we'll see what ultimately happens with it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.